name is Kergosien. This topic, I guess in the guide, or at least on the mobile site, it said Managing Web Services. The title is Managing Your Wibbly-Wobbly Ball of Web Services. It's supposed to be a tie-in to Doctor Who, and you'll see some references throughout here, and I'll actually give you a brief overview of what Doctor Who is in case you just came for the web services and you have no idea what that is. It's not, you can get content out of this without knowing what the references are, but I actually have, I'm not employed right now by a company, so I've spent the last few months organizing a conference in Nashville named Music City Code. So normally where I put my company and my position, I put that information up there, and I'll have some links at the end of the slides for my blog and Music City Code website, so if you need more info. These slides aren't currently up online, but they will be, so don't feel like you have to take notes. If it's on the slide, it'll be out there. And I don't know if you can see it over on this side of the room, but my Twitter handle's in the corner. Feel free to tweet, preferably if you like it. If you don't tweet that. So let's talk about the Doctor for a second. So Doctor Who is the show. The Doctor is the character. He is a Time Lord. You might notice a bunch of different actors here. That's because every time he dies, when he's resurrected, he comes back with a new body. So when you see different characters throughout here, you might not recognize all of them, but that's different doctors generally. That's really all you need to know, and for those who are fans, you'll get a little chuckle, and for those who aren't, just bear with me. So the reason for this talk is that we're seeing a trend in the IT landscape. It used to be IT departments supported a very small subset of the business functions. They were able to handle pretty much everything that needed to be done when it came to computers. Now everything's related to computers. Pretty much everything a business does relates to some sort of solution, either on the internet or the company infrastructure, on mobile devices. IT companies or IT departments are having trouble keeping up with corporate needs. This is often met by outsourcing, whether that's to vendors or offshore teams or even to departments within the company. Very often, IT doesn't take kindly to that. For one thing, IT's job is to make sure that the solutions are stable and dependable. And it's very difficult to do that when you don't have control of it all. So there's constant battle that's developed between many departments. Like, for instance, marketing is trying to come up with agile solutions and get things out the door, and they can't wait on IT to do it. But IT doesn't want to just hand the reins over. They don't want to say, you can use our servers for whatever you want to use them for. They have to plan appropriately and scale correctly. And so this is the struggle that we're trying to overcome. Many of your companies might not be seeing this struggle yet, but I'm hoping that through this talk, I can help illustrate some of the things you want to keep in mind so that as you plan your approach, you can plan for this growth and address it before it becomes a problem. So before service-oriented architecture came along, and we'll talk about that in a moment, the traditional approach was you build a solution, it's well architected, you plan for it to be expanded, then you add to the solution a bit, create a new aspect to it, but you reuse some of the components. Maybe your business layer gets reused. That's good architecture. I mean, that's a good approach. But then you have this other big project, and it doesn't really need the same exact dependencies, so it kind of ties in a little bit, maybe it touches on the other solution, and then you get these other ones that pop up around it that the things you develop don't really fit their needs exactly, so you have to build other things to fit their needs. So over time, it becomes this massive overall company architecture that becomes very difficult to understand. Domain knowledge becomes much more important, and it's difficult to ramp people up on it. So this is what we're trying to avoid. Anybody here have this issue currently? I'm guessing a few, since that's why you're here probably. This often results in very custom solutions. Anybody know what this is? Just shout out. I guess the pineapple on the core probably gives it away. So this is a specialized tool that you can use to core your pineapple to get it out in spirals. How many other uses does this have? I haven't found one. I mean, I own one, but I don't use it for anything else but that. So that's generally how we develop services traditionally, is you need it for something, you develop the service for it, and that's what you have. We'll get into some other options in a moment. So what is this slide about? Oh yeah, well, I'm just highlighting some of the things that come out of the pre-service-oriented architecture approach, and I touched on quite a few of these already. So that's pretty terrifying for developers, especially when you're tasked with maintaining these things and adding features down the road. It's difficult, they become a little bit fragile. So service-oriented architecture, this has been around for quite a few years. The idea is this center layer here, that's your services, and they can be used by various solutions. Of course, oftentimes we find that the services we develop are still very customized towards the need, and then when a new need comes along, we have to build a new solution, so very few of them overlap. But ideally, we can plan ahead, and the key to doing this is making our solutions as small as, or our services as small as possible. That way they can be reused more readily. The important things to know about service-oriented architecture, there's 4 main points, at least that's what I've gathered from reading about it, that boundaries are explicit. So there's no hidden assumptions in using these. Everything is in the contract between the service and whoever's consuming that service. They're autonomous, means if I start using a service for a solution, it's not going to change on me and then my solution is going to break. That's where versioning and approaches like backwards compatibility come in. They share a contract, but not a class, meaning I know how to interact with this service, but I don't need to provide it anything like a state or, what was another example? No other information about the other parts of the system is needed in order for me to function, to use this class. And there's also an aspect for compatibility where you have policies, where you can expose policies, but that's a bit more involved, so we won't get into that. I just want everybody to understand what we're talking about as far as service-oriented architecture. Any questions on that? Anything that I didn't explain well enough to move on? All right. So I think of service-oriented architecture in its best approach being like a bunch of toolboxes. So this truck, you drive it out to a location and you have everything on this truck that you need to do the job. Now you might only need this one cabinet for a specific job, or you might need parts of the different cabinets, but it's all there. And ideally in a service-oriented architecture, I'd like to have all my tools available so that if I want to build something, it's not going to take a bunch of custom work to expose those services. And everybody gets excited about this. It's wonderful. Microservices come along. We're not going to get too deep into microservices, but the main thing you need to know is they're independently deployable services. You don't have one massive platform that exposes all your services necessarily. These are individual pieces that can be easily deployed. They're small enough that it doesn't really matter if they're reused as much. I'm not an expert in the field, so if anybody has anything to add on that, maybe clarify, then please, you're welcome to speak up. But I just want to make sure y'all knew that that is a different approach that's being discussed now. And the perception of this has been a little bit mixed. I'm not really sure where I stand on it yet, so again, if you're not willing to speak up in here, feel free to hit me up afterwards. I'd love to talk about it. But the important thing, no matter what your API strategy to start with, is knowing what type of assets you're trying to expose. And usually we're talking about data here, or functionality. So you maybe want to expose product data, inventory, location information, analytics, or you want to allow the user to place orders, to post information like you do on Twitter through their API, geocoding, where you're giving it information and getting something back based on that. These are all things that you want to identify, and then ideally you're going to go around to your different stakeholders and figure out which ones are the highest priority so you can focus on those initially, because it all doesn't have to be done at once. So then you want to figure out who's going to use these assets. We won't get too deep into specifics because it depends on your situation, but we will talk about a few different approaches based on your audience. So the most common approach for the APIs that we see every day are public APIs, like Twitter, for instance. This is a situation where you want anybody to be able to get access to it. You might want to control that access, like how much access they have, but it's not a specific subgroup, like internal to your network. Generally, the idea is to expose resources so other people can innovate with those resources. So for instance, FedEx exposes their tracking information, so you can build an app that uses their tracking information in some innovative way. And it also it allows companies to go into new lines of business they hadn't previously considered. This happens a lot with Google Maps, for instance, or Bing Maps, where they're mapping APIs used in ways they never thought of. So if we take a step back from being public, you have protected APIs. Here, we're trying to expose them to people outside the corporation, but it's a very select group, usually vendors or maybe some sort of clients. We can maybe be a little bit less strict about what we expose in these services, but we have to be able to control access to them now. And yeah, that's all for that. And then we have private APIs. That's obviously internal to your company or to your group. I guess the biggest thing here is you have much more control on how these are used, so you can predict better how these services should be built. But at the same time, you don't want to make too many assumptions because marketing might come up with some innovative idea that you hadn't thought of. So once you know what your assets are that you want to expose and who you're trying to expose them to, we need to figure out who's going to be involved in the process of doing this. So we start off with the developer. There's people who are going to create the functionality to access these assets. They need to know what the architecture will look like. What kind of architectural approach are you taking? Is this going to be a RESTful approach where you have a resource-based system? How many people here are familiar with REST? Okay, so most of the room. Just for anybody else, the idea with REST is that you have very small, standardized services that are based around resources, usually using HTTP, but that's not necessarily dependent. Another popular approach is SOAP services. That's a bit heavier of a protocol, and it's built for a lot more functionality that you might not need. So, but I digress on that. So once we figure out what the needs or the plan is for the API developer, we need to consider the product manager. That's the person who's maintaining this information. So if it's a company that sells products, somebody is in charge of that product information and what can be exposed and who it should be exposed to. And they're going to need to be involved in the deployment process of how their functionality to expose these resources is going to take place. So the app developers, that's your audience. Whether this is somebody in marketing who's trying to build an app to get you more visibility on your product, or it's the public who you want to be able to use your resources to innovate. Either way, they're going to need to know what you have available, how to use your functionality, how to request it if you don't have it automatically accessible to everybody. And we'll get into that in a moment. And then often overlooked aspect from the development perspective is operations. Especially if you're creating a multi-use toolbox where these services could be used by one solution that's used only internally within your company, or that same service could be used externally by millions of customers. They need insight into what the plan is for that use, and they need to be able to get analytics on how it's being used, especially related to performance. If your services start underperforming, they need to be able to react to that, preferably as proactively as possible. How many people here recognize the doctors? Okay, so the theme's at least hitting home with half of you. So as we said in the session description, the main things we're trying to accomplish with this API management platform is reuse of services, which allows us to get fast access, especially for prototyping new solutions and new ideas. And we'll get into some tricks for exposing those in a way that they can get that access much more quickly than traditionally. Consistency is a big thing, because this way you don't have 5 different services that expose the same data in slightly different ways, and then somebody says you need to change the way that data is accessed, and you got to figure out what all services access it and how. You can keep this much more centralized and organized. One overlooked aspect is licensing costs. If your company uses a service for geocoding, for instance, such as Bing location services, they have an account, and the more use they use on that account, the cheaper it gets. Whereas if every department in your company has their own account, you don't get that bulk discount. And for large enterprises, that can add up to a lot of savings. Caching is also overlooked often. We think about it from a developer perspective. How am I going to cache this data so that it's available to the site? But what about a geographical perspective? So I'm going to talk about some cloud solutions for API management, and those give you cloud caching ability, where somebody across the country can get those results quicker from a location closer to them, and it doesn't even use your internal resources. And of course, the big one from an architecture perspective is we want to decouple our systems. We want to make sure that any changes we make on the back end aren't going to break things unexpectedly on the front end. And that goes back to that consistency. If I consume a service, I should be able to continue consuming that service in the same way. It's not going to suddenly change on me and cause me issues. I've kind of blown through a lot of this so far, so any questions or comments on any of that? before we get into the actual platform? All right. So this is a example layout based on a project I did last year for a large tire manufacturer. And we were using Mashry as our platform. So I want you to take a look at it in all its awesomeness. I'm extremely clever with what I've come up with, right? But we're going to focus specifically on the admin section to start. So we've talked about all the things we're trying to accomplish with this platform, but how do you go about it? Most platforms include a management console, some way to interact to set up your system, to make modifications, to pull analytics. The big things you're going to need to do in there is configure your endpoints, so that's where your services are accessed. This acts as a proxy, which helps to decouple your services. So, for instance, I talked about using Bing location services, exposing that through your API management platform so all your departments can make use of it. Well, not only can you track the usage for each of those departments based on their key or their security method, but if you decide that you no longer want to use Bing and you want to go to Google location services, you can very likely change that out on the back end and use the same front-end endpoint. So this is where you do that. You have to be careful with some of the offerings because right now a lot of them boast protocol translation, and what they mean by that is you can write custom functionality to translate the protocol. But a few of them actually offer the ability to, for instance, expose a SOAP service and allow it to be consumed as a REST service. Now keep in mind that doesn't translate the architecture. If you build a SOAP service that's functional, it doesn't become a resource-driven REST service automatically. But there is some translation ability to where if, for instance, you have a back-end system that can only expose SOAP services and you want to call it from a mobile app that you want to be able to do RESTful calls, you can support that. What I'd like to get into, though, which is kind of a fun topic, is packaging. So the way that Mashry in particular works, and the others have their own versions of this, but the concepts carry over, is you have a concept of packages and then plans. So the package is an organization of services so that people can navigate them and request them. So you might package, for instance, all your product services together if you think that's the way it's going to be used. Consider, though, that somebody might need a cross-section of your services for their specific implementation. For instance, a dealer might need specific product services, specific inventory services, a few location services. So you can create packages based on need as well. Plans allow you to create levels of use for that package. This is where I said for rapid prototyping, it's really nice to have a plan that allows for very minimal use and also doesn't require much approval on the back end. We'll talk about the approval process in a moment, but the idea being that if I'm only requesting to call this service 5 times a day, then infrastructure really doesn't need to know about that impact. It's not going to change the resources used on the back end much. So there's going to be a different approval process than something I'm going to throw out to millions of customers. Any questions about the packages and plans concept? Has anybody done anything like this before? Oh, okay. Well, at least it's new stuff. So security is a big aspect. Now, you don't want your service security to be built into your platform. It doesn't cover all your security needs. You still need to validate users to make sure they are accessing the data they have access to, whatever your business needs are. This is more access security, so making sure that the right people can get to the right fields, for instance. Yeah, we do that through filtering, at least on Mashry. And this is an example filter layout. So this allows us to reuse services a lot more readily because I can expose, say, a product service, and then I can say certain users get access to all the product fields, but certain users have filters applied to their access to which strip out the pricing because I don't want those users to see pricing. And I don't have slides on this, but these are all built on the idea of having roles in your system. So I have a role for dealers, I have a role for vendors and trusted partners or whatever, however your business breaks down. So I can say a certain role is filtered to these fields. And that means that I have one service on the back end to maintain, one code base, but my management layer actually controls who can see what. Again, you still want authentication on the back end, so this isn't to replace that. So personally, I think this is the biggest thing. This cuts down on how many services we have to create, makes our lives a lot easier. So that's the admin side. And there's a lot more to admin that we can go into more detail. I just want to make sure I cover the highlights so we can focus on what areas y'all are interested in. From the developer perspective, we want to know how to get to these services. That's where the developer portal comes in. So this is somewhere where the developers can go to see what you have to offer, read about those offerings. These are the packages we were talking about. Then see what kind of plans are available to be able to select the correct plan. They want to be able to request access, which in our example, the way that that request was done is we tied in with SharePoint for our workflows. We didn't want to have to build our own approval engine because SharePoint does a lot of that for us already. So Mastery in particular, and I'm not promoting Mastery, I don't get any kickbacks, but that's what I'm familiar with. They have a trigger system where you can give it an endpoint and it will call that endpoint and give the information. So for instance, when somebody puts in a request for access to a package and a plan, that would trigger this call to an endpoint. And we created an intermediary service in between that would receive that request because it's not very smart. You can't really configure a lot. You just kind of have to tell it, here's where to go, and it's going to give you the information however it wants to give it to you. And then our intermediary service called SharePoint in the way that it expected to be called. And of course, you can implement whatever workflow engine you want. But that allows you to then say, this person requested very limited product data. They only want it for prototyping purposes, so they're limited to very few calls a day, which that's managed by the management platform as well, how much access they can get. Or you can throttle how quickly they can access it. So maybe there's not a limit per day, but there's a limit per minute. And then if that request only needs to be approved by, say, the product owner to say, yes, they have access to that data, then it goes to them, they check off yes, and it shoots back the service call to Mastery or whatever your platform is to say, this is approved, go ahead and give them a key. Or in our case, we used keys. You can use usernames and other methods, but keys are the most common, I think, in the industry. So that was, we talked about documentation, about finding what you need. Anybody have any other examples of documentation that they specifically found helpful when consuming services? Like you're writing an application to use Bing location services and you needed some sort of documentation to get you on the wall? No? Yeah? So those are engines for exposing your documentation?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I've used
or those are the sites that you used that they had good documentation. So what kind of documentation do you find most helpful in there? Was it simply the description of the?
And, all the calls you can make, what parameters, what expected responses. Use Swagger, I think, for producing that.
Swagger is a common tool that's used for producing it. Yeah, you definitely want to give information on what the request should look like, so what parameters are going to be passed into the service, and what your response is going to look like. One nice tool for that in some of these online services is these test harnesses, where you can pick what service you want to call, you can assign what key you're using, and you can simulate calling that service. And some of them will actually spit out the request information, the body of the request, and what the response was. On the back end, from an administrative point of view, you can also do logging on this to see what request was sent to my API management platform, what request was then relayed to my backend service, what response was sent to that platform, and what got to the customer. Because that's not necessarily the same thing. Some of your filters might actually modify fields. So you want to know, if they're not getting what they expect, was it my service or was it the way the platform's set up? Any other pieces of documentation that anybody's found helpful?
Yeah, I sometimes use Mash8 for consuming public APIs, and Mash8 does something similar where it gets between the client and the service.
That was Mash8 as in the number 8? Mash8, okay. And I've only been doing this for a year and a half, so I'm not the expert by any means. That's part of the reason why I'm asking for these suggestions from the audience as well. Excellent. Anybody else have any? Personally, I think happy path documentation is probably the most important. I'm guessing for most services, 9 out of 10 users are going to use it the exact same way. So if you can have an example of how that service is used, maybe in the most common languages that they would write it in, then that gets most people started without even having to dig into your more detailed documentation. Also on the engagement side, I'm not really focusing so much on this, but especially if you're doing public APIs, it doesn't really help to have a public API out there unless you let people know about it. So you want to make sure that you can onboard them and give them all the information they need about what your business is and what the opportunities are, and things that aren't technical, not part of that developer documentation. Forums can cross both these boundaries. That can allow you to have a running dialogue with your users, but we won't get too deep into that side of the developer portal. So fantastic. We now have a way for people to publish APIs, and we have a way for people to access APIs. What about how they actually get the API callback? That's where we start talking about the traffic managers. So this is the component that actually takes the request from the user and gives them the response back. In the case of Mastery and many of the other solutions, they can actually have one in the cloud that's hosted that you pay for on a regular basis, and you can have one locally inside your enterprise. Part of the reason for this, if you can see the routing that we've set up, if you make the request from inside the enterprise for an internal resource, why should your request go out to the cloud and then back into the enterprise to get the data, then back out to the cloud and then back to you? You want to keep that loop as small as possible. So the internal copy of the traffic manager helps with that. And they're set up to where they synchronize with the cloud traffic manager. So you configure it one place in the cloud, and then the internal traffic manager synchronizes its settings with the cloud. And that way you don't have to worry about managing it independently. It just mirrors that configuration. And we did this through DNS entries. So when you do a request for api.yourcompanyname.com or whatever address you choose, on the internet, that's going to resolve to the cloud traffic manager. Internally, you can reroute that DNS resolution to your local server. Any questions about that specifically? I know probably some people here aren't familiar with infrastructure and routing. Probably not of interest to you anyway then. Just know that it's something you can do, and it's a feature that's available. We also talked about some of the other features of traffic managers, so I don't think we really need to delve too deeply into that. That's just the piece that facilitates that portion. We talked about protocol support, and that this is where the caching is going to occur. You also can generate a lot of analytics from this. Instead of writing your own system to monitor performance and log that information, that'll be logged and generated for you. Of course, you have to write your own reporting, because very little reporting is usually provided. They don't know what kind of data you're going to need. But all that's already available to you from day one. Any questions about this overall architecture or suggestions on how it might apply better to your scenario? No? Okay. As far as platforms are concerned, this is from last year, so it's not completely updated, but this is the Gartner Magic Quadrant of API management and governance platforms. And you'll see that I've been talking about Mastery in particular, which is now owned by Intel. It's down here in this section of the quadrant. What this means is the farther to the right of it is, the more complete their vision is, and the higher up in the chart is, the better their execution. So this quadrant is what they call the Magic Quadrant, where you've both fulfilled your vision and you've executed well. So anybody up in here is considered to be one of the leaders in that area. And of course, they do their best to pull these metrics in general, but some of these are going to apply better depending on your scenario. For instance, the company I worked for, did this project for, chose Mastery partially because they already had a SAP process orchestration component in their enterprise, and that met some of the needs that, for instance, what was another one they were considering? I think it was Apogee has a component that does that as well, but they would have paid extra for that, and they already had that, so they didn't need it. Anybody have any experience with any of these? Nope. Okay. Well, it seems like I might have blown over some of the more basic concepts because I expected more people who had already done it, which is awesome that we have people who are doing it for the first time. But I'm interested in going back and trying to cover a few things that I glossed over. So anybody willing to raise their hand and let me know an area that they didn't quite follow that I can spend a little bit more time on? Yeah.
I'm kind of curious about user identity management. How you manage those identities within the on-premises system, but then also trying to federate those.
So when you say users, are you talking about developers who are developing applications and going to need to authenticate, or you mean end users who are going to use the? Okay, so that's something that would actually be outside of your management platform, and that's a good example of the security you'd want in your services themselves. In my opinion, it's not a good idea to tie that sort of business rule level security into a management platform, because you're actually talking about business rules at that point. Anybody else have a different perspective on that? Now, when you start talking about consumers of services, for instance, if you have a public API and you want to make it available to developers and you need to manage the developer user base, it does get very interesting as to what kind of approaches you have there. You have to consider whether you want individual developers to be able to have accounts and them individually to have control of those instead of a company, which means if the developer leaves the company, who owns the access now, who has control of that key? Mashery specifically has the ability to transfer a key from one user to another, and that's controlled by the API owner who issued that key. But it's something to consider as to whether you want to even allow individuals to have that associated with their contact information and email address. They also do have the ability to integrate using SAML, so that you can, well, I forget what the directory solution is that we use, but you can tie it in with Active Directory or other LDAP solutions. So you can use your internal user base and not have to create external accounts in addition to those. So if you did, I guess to complete the answer to your question, if you did want to tie those into your front-end management platform, if you had a need for that, then that would probably be your best bet, is to tie it in through their SAML or their OAuth integration, so that you're automatically pulling those users in. And it usually just creates a ghost copy of that user on their system that's associated, so that they can keep the properties they need on that ghost user. Does that answer your question? All right. Great. Anybody else? Not a specific question even? Yeah.
The management layer handles, you write one service that kind of can do it all, and the management layer filters that out.
Let's jump back to that. That's the response filters? So for instance, going back to the product service, you want to write a product service that's as generic as possible if you want it to be reused. So you'd want to be able to accept filters. I really like OData services for this, because it has built-in infrastructure for filtering and paging and sorting, and you don't have to write all that yourself. And it's very versatile. But you have specific fields that's going to return, and you might not want everybody to have access to all those fields. And that would be extra code on your side to try to manage that. Unless it's something you track on your side with user properties. For instance, this user has been granted access to these fields. If it's a role-based approach, then it's really easy to implement that in the platform, where you can specify roles, and then whenever a user signs up for access to your service, they join one of those roles. And that will have an approval process, because you need to verify this user really is a dealer, for instance. Once they're verified, that's done, and you don't have to do that again for individual service requests. You can automatically say, well, now that we know they're a dealer, we can apply these filters to all their requests, and the results they get back are appropriate for them. You can build even more complex filters that would, for instance, translate integer values into enumerations. There's all sorts of translation you can do within the traffic manager as well. In fact, I would say it's almost infinitely flexible if you're willing to pay the vendor to develop those, because usually it's not something you can do yourself. That give you a little bit more information on that?
Yeah, so you're building your service to, it's not like your service gets back like the big blob, and your management layer redacts things that it doesn't need, but if you're building your service to actually talk to the management layer.
Oh, I see. So I guess I wasn't clear on that. I prefer, first of all, building very light services where, for instance, paging is used to give back very small sets of results. And in this case, it would be, the interaction is the user makes the request to the service makes the request to the backend server, which gives back all the fields for that given record set. And then the traffic manager would actually strip out the columns of data that the end user did not have access to based on their role. So it would only be the request and response. There wouldn't be multiple round trips for that. Great question. Yeah.
You mentioned the domain routing to the Mashable traffic manager handles all that. Does that handle, you also mentioned the customer-based, where it's a private service for, a company with multiple database and app server type of thing, or does it?
So the question was whether the routing of IP resolution or name resolution to the traffic manager.
Their database versus.
Oh, whether that would handle which database is being hit by the service.
Is that what the function of that is, or is that more for?
So this was more from an infrastructure perspective of what traffic manager is fulfilling the request, whether you want to make the trip out to the cloud or stay internal to the company. Of course, you could use it more flexibly because you could create custom rules in the management platform to say, based on the role or the user that this comes from, pass on some information as a parameter to the backend service. So the backend service can then decide what database to hit. You've got some flexibility there. But this is more about where you want the request to go and where do you want the response to come from. Good question. Any other areas that anybody appreciate focusing on? Not sure what time. It's 5:52.
You guys chose Mastery, and you said you looked at Apogee as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can you comment on what you saw from other options and what you went with Mastery?
I'm not the most familiar with all the options. I do know that Mastery is a fairly young product. From our interaction with their support, they're very ready to work with you, but they also need to work with you on a lot of aspects. Whereas from my impression, Apogee, for instance, has a more mature product. It might not be mature in all the new features, but the base features require less interaction with support. So to give you an idea, we actually worked with Mastery for over a year on how we were going to implement this. It wasn't all because of them, it was because the client dragged things out as well. But there was a lot of back and forth with their sales side before they ever passed this off to their support side as implemented. So I guess that would be the biggest thing I would look at is once you figure out who can meet the features you need, investigate how robust those features are. For instance, I mentioned protocol translation as being one of those things you need to take a little closer look at. Mastery does advertise, or at least as of 6 months ago, they advertised that they provide protocol translation. But what that really means is you can create custom functionality to translate those protocols. Otherwise, it's simply you can create your own SOAP request as an HTTP request, and it'll translate it from one protocol to another. But that's not very user-friendly. SOAP, for instance, doesn't handle not getting the right parameters nearly as gracefully as traditional HTTP service does. But did that answer your question?
Yeah. I'm just exploring this for the first time. I've had a need to do something like this for a while where I work, and anyway, I haven't stumbled on the right solution. And yeah, I'm just looking for. Yes, you did answer my question. It would be really interesting. Well, I guess maybe as a follow-up, what services were not documented, if any, in this effort?
What features of the platform?
Yeah, so like in advertising the API capabilities of the company for public purposes, but also for the developer experience internally, that listing is interesting. Are there services that weren't listed or that weren't managed?
All the ones I looked at offer a cloud solution, but I believe Apogee is one of the ones that you can decide not to use their cloud solution at all and completely host it in-house. So that's something to consider. But as far as public APIs, using those cloud solutions can tie you into a large user base. So for instance, when using Mastery, if somebody wants to sign up to use one of your packages on your portal, which, by the way, you can put a layer in between there where you even have to give them access to your portal to even see your packages. But in a public API, you're showing everybody what you have to offer. And if they already have a Mastery account, if they've used another API through Mastery, then they can just log into that same Mastery account and sign up to use your package as well. So there's no custom authentication needed for your company in particular. And I'm guessing that all the other cloud solutions would work very similarly to that.
But I guess my question is specifically the service capabilities of whoever employed you. Were there things that weren't put into Mastery?
Things they were looking for that they didn't get?
Capabilities that did not put in this management system. Services they did not put in the management system.
Oh, services they exposed that didn't go through the management platform. Okay, now I understand your question. Yeah, we actually, we were very specific to only expose through the management platform services that were expected to be reused. So if there's a one-off service that's meant for a very specific product and we don't expect it to be needed by any other department or vendor, then it never got into this because there was just no point in managing it through this because you knew exactly what your load was going to be, what your usage was going to be. They didn't expect to onboard new developers for it. But that would be a decision within your company about what features you want to leverage on that service because maybe there's some analytics you'd like and then you could put it into a package, for instance, that's not visible to your users, but it's still logged through your traffic manager. Thanks. Any other questions or areas you want like for me to go into a little deeper? All right. Well, I think we have a few minutes left, but that's all the slides I've got. If you want to come up and chat about API management or API architectures, I'd love to talk about with it more. And if you're interested in Music City Code, that's in Nashville on August 29th. The tickets are $50, and it's a short Southwest flight up, so we'd love to have you. Thanks for coming.